Shade crouched in the darkened corner of the ventilation shaft, barely breathing, eyes fixed on the scene below. The alien warlord Zarnak stood with his back to the enormous viewports of his command chamber, his hulking figure outlined against the vastness of space. His booming voice echoed off the cold, metallic walls, full of contempt as he addressed his council of subordinates. Each of the warlord's lieutenants bowed, their faces twisted in mock respect, while Zarnak sneered at their deference. "They think Earth is a threat?" Zarnak's laugh was a low, growling sound. "These humans, with their primitive weapons and reliance on brute force, believe they can resist the might of the Galactic Dominion?" Shade's pulse quickened. His target was right there, arrogantly unaware that death was looming just above him. The mission was simple: eliminate Zarnak, destabilize the Dominion's leadership, and prevent the coming invasion. Yet nothing about the reality of it felt simple. One wrong move, one misstep, and not only would Earth be enslaved, but the Silent Order, Shade's brothers and sisters, would fall with it. He scanned the room again, observing every movement with precision. The command chamber was as sterile and cold as the warlord himself, built for intimidation. The walls shimmered with dark steel, and every console was equipped with the latest in alien tech. Glowing blue screens projected advanced tactical data about the invasion force's readiness. Beneath the sleek facade of technology, though Shade knew the Dominion's Achilles heel, they had never faced warriors who could strike from the shadows. He checked the time on his wrist device. A 30-second window. That's all he would have once the distraction began. Below, Zarnak continued his rant. "Once we crush Earth, we'll claim their resources and enslave the population. The humans will be no more than a footnote in the history of our conquest." The other warlords nodded, but Shade detected subtle glances exchanged between them. Zarnak might believe he commanded absolute loyalty, but Shade saw the cracks forming in their ranks. The lieutenants' eyes betrayed their resentment, their own ambitions suppressed under Zarnak's iron rule. It was the kind of simmering tension that could be used to his advantage, if he survived long enough to exploit it. A soft beep sounded in his earpiece. The distraction had been triggered. The lights in the room flickered once, then went out. A perfect blackout. Shade moved like a shadow, slipping silently from the vent and landing in a crouch, his boots making no sound against the sleek floor. He unsheathed his blade, a single-edged weapon forged with the old techniques, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim, emergency lighting. He was nearly invisible. Zarnak's voice cut through the darkness. "What is this?" "Systems report." Panic hadn't set in yet. They were too reliant on their technology, expecting it to recover instantly. Shade knew better. Earth's finest engineers had crafted this virus specifically for the Dominion's systems. The blackout would last just long enough for him to strike. Moving with precision, Shade glided toward Zarnak. Every breath he took was measured, controlled, his muscles coiled for the moment of the kill. The warlord was still barking orders when Shade closed the distance, his blade poised to slice through the thick armor at Zarnak's neck. But then, in a blink, everything changed. A sudden, high-pitched whine filled the room, followed by a shimmering field of light. Shade froze, his instincts screaming at him to retreat, but it was too late. Zarnak's personal shield flared to life, a bubble of pulsating energy that surrounded the warlord in an impenetrable dome. Shade's heart sank. This wasn't part of the plan. The shield had been unexpected, a last-minute addition to Zarnak's defenses, and now Shade found himself trapped inside, with no way out. "Did you really think you could sneak up on me, human?" Zarnak's voice was a deep growl now, the arrogance replaced with cold fury. His glowing red eyes locked onto Shade, even through the field. "I knew Earth would send one of its little assassins. You're not the first. But you will be the last." Shade's mind raced. The mission was crumbling before his eyes. He needed to adapt fast. He scanned the room again, assessing his options. The shield was an advanced energy field, keyed to Zarnak's vital signs. Killing him would drop the shield, but it was too strong for his blade to penetrate directly. Zarnak stepped forward, the heavy thud of his armored boots shaking the floor. Shade backed away instinctively, feeling the shield closing in around him. The walls of the dome pulsed with energy, making the air crackle with static. "Tell me, human," Zarnak sneered. "Did you think your primitive tricks would work on me? You're outmatched, outsmarted, and utterly alone." Shade said nothing, his silence unnerving the warlord. He wasn't alone, though. His mind was already calculating the next move. Behind the shield generator, tucked within the command center's intricate wiring, was the main control node for the ship's systems. If Shade could overload it, the shield would collapse, but he had only seconds before Zarnak called for reinforcements. The warlord's eyes narrowed, sensing Shade's focus shift. "Oh, trying to find a way out, are we? It's too late. Your planet will burn, and there's nothing you can do about it." Shade's pulse quickened, adrenaline sharpening his thoughts. His only option was to move faster than Zarnak could react. In one swift motion, he activated the small EMP device hidden in his belt. The blast would be limited, only disabling systems within the shield itself. But it would be enough. The device beeped once. Zarnak's eyes widened as he realized what Shade was about to do. "You fool!" Shade triggered the EMP. The shield flickered, sputtering as the energy field collapsed. For a brief, frozen moment, Zarnak stood exposed, his face twisted in shock and rage. Shade lunged, his blade flashing in the dim light, aiming for the warlord's throat. But before the blade could strike, an alarm blared through the ship. The doors to the command chamber burst open, and a squad of heavily armed guards rushed in, weapons raised. Shade spun around, the blade still poised in his hand, trapped between finishing the mission and facing a new, immediate threat. The odds had just shifted. The blast doors hissed open, and the squad of alien guards flooded into the chamber, weapons raised. Shade's pulse raced as his mind calculated the odds, but none of them favored him. The EMP had done its job, collapsing Zarnak's shield, but now the warlord's personal guard stood between Shade and his target. Each soldier wore advanced combat armor, their helmets bristling with tech designed to detect threats unseen by the naked eye. For a moment, Shade considered retreat. The mission was paramount, but survival was key to completing it. The Silent Order always taught its operatives the value of patience. An incomplete mission could be returned to, but a dead agent was a failure. Yet retreating now would give Zarnak time to fortify. Worse, it would signal to Earth that their elite assassin had fallen short. Shade couldn't allow that. From across the chamber, Zarnak stood, his eyes blazing with fury. "Seize him!" the warlord bellowed. His voice held the weight of command, and the guards moved as one, advancing on Shade with deadly precision. Shade tightened his grip on the blade, his breath steadying. He wasn't out of options yet. In one fluid motion, he flicked his wrist, sending a trio of smoke pellets skittering across the floor. Instantly, thick, dark smoke billowed up, enveloping the room in a dense, impenetrable cloud. The guards hesitated, their vision obscured, and in that moment of confusion, Shade acted. He moved like a ghost, slipping through the smoke, his footsteps silent. The guards fumbled with their helmets, trying to activate thermal imaging, but Shade was trained to counter even that. His suit's material masked his heat signature, rendering him nearly invisible to their sensors. The first guard fell before he even registered Shade's presence. A sharp strike to the neck, a quick twist of the wrist, and the soldier crumpled to the ground. Shade caught the falling weapon in midair, spinning it around and firing a single shot into the next guard's visor, shattering it with a blast of energy. 2 down, but more were coming, their weapons raised, firing blindly into the smoke. Shade ducked behind a console, the blaster hum still vibrating in the air. Zarnak's voice cut through the chaos. "Fools! He's just one man! Find him!" The warlord's arrogance was his downfall, Shade thought. He believed sheer numbers could overpower skill, that brute force could crush the precision of a trained assassin. But Shade knew better. The Silent Order's strength came not from overwhelming power, but from silence, patience, and control. As the guards fanned out, searching for him, Shade's mind raced. He couldn't stay in one place for long. The mission was still in jeopardy, and Zarnak was moments away from realizing the gravity of his situation. If the warlord escaped, everything would be lost. Shade's gaze flickered to the control node just across the room. If he could reach it, he could still sabotage the ship's systems, buying himself precious time to finish what he'd started. But the guards were closing in fast. He'd have to create another diversion, something bigger, something that would draw their attention away from him completely. From beneath his cloak, Shade pulled a small device no larger than his palm. A timed explosive. It wasn't powerful enough to destroy the ship, but it would destabilize the chamber and force the guards to focus on containment. The distraction would give him the window he needed. He activated the device, setting the timer for 30 seconds, and slipped it beneath the nearest console. Moving swiftly, he climbed the walls, using the narrow ledges and ducts to remain unseen, silently positioning himself near the control node. As the seconds ticked down, Shade braced himself. The explosion was small but precise, tearing through the lower half of the chamber and sending debris flying. The guards were thrown off balance, their attention immediately diverted to the source of the blast. Smoke and sparks filled the air, and alarms blared throughout the ship. Zarnak roared in anger, his voice booming even over the chaos. "Contain that blast! Don't let him escape!" Shade used the moment of confusion to drop down silently next to the control node. His fingers moved quickly over the alien interface, bypassing the security systems with practiced ease. His training in the Silent Order had included hacking into foreign tech, and this was no different. Within moments, he had uploaded the virus. It would spread through the ship's systems, disabling communications, navigation, and weapons. The Dominion's flagship was now a floating hunk of metal, completely vulnerable. But just as Shade prepared to retreat, the control panel emitted a high-pitched beep. His eyes widened. Something was wrong. The control node's interface flickered, and then, with a sudden rush of static, it rebooted. Shade froze as the holographic display shifted, revealing an override system he hadn't anticipated. The virus had been detected, and worse, it had triggered a countermeasure. The ship's systems were now in lockdown. From behind him, Zarnak's heavy footsteps pounded across the floor. The warlord's voice was low and menacing. "Did you really think we wouldn't prepare for something like this? You may have disabled our ship, human, but you've trapped yourself inside." Shade glanced around, his mind racing. The guards had regrouped, and they were closing in. The ship's defenses were offline, but so was every escape route. He was trapped, just as Zarnak had said. And the warlord's eyes gleamed with a cruel satisfaction. "Your mission ends here, assassin," Zarnak growled, stepping closer, his massive frame blocking the path to the exit. "You'll die knowing you failed your world." For the first time, Shade felt the weight of failure pressing against his chest. But he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. His hand hovered over the emergency release switch on his wrist device. It was a last resort, a mechanism that would flood the entire chamber with a powerful neurotoxin designed to incapacitate anyone within seconds. But it came with a cost. His own body would be affected as well. He could only hope his training would allow him to endure it long enough to escape. As Zarnak stepped closer, his massive hand reaching for Shade, the assassin made his decision. He pressed the switch. The chamber hissed, and a thin, almost invisible mist began to spread. Zarnak stopped, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "What is this?" he snarled. Shade's breath slowed, his vision already beginning to blur as the toxin took effect. He had seconds before it overwhelmed him. But that was all he needed. The guards staggered, their movements sluggish as the toxin filled the room. One by one they collapsed, their weapons clattering to the floor. Zarnak stumbled, gasping for air, but his eyes were still fixed on Shade, filled with fury and disbelief. "You won't win!" But Shade was already moving, his body a blur as he sprinted toward the exit. His lungs burned, and his vision darkened, but he pushed through the pain. He would not fail. He could not fail. As he reached the door, his strength began to fade. His legs wobbled, and the world tilted dangerously. Shade slammed his hand against the door control, barely registering the hiss as it slid open. But as the darkness closed in, a shadow appeared at the far end of the corridor. Reinforcements. Shade's last thought before he collapsed was simple: he hadn't escaped yet. Shade's senses returned in fragments. First, the sound of footsteps, heavy and methodical, echoing through the metallic corridor. Then the cold bite of the floor beneath him, a stark reminder of the battle he just survived. His body was leaden, the effects of the neurotoxin still weighing him down, making each breath a struggle. The reinforcements were close. He could hear the familiar hum of energy weapons being charged, the alien guards preparing to finish what the toxin had started. He couldn't move, not yet. His training had prepared him for almost every contingency, but there was no escape from the toxin coursing through his veins. It was only sheer willpower that kept his mind alert, focused on the urgent need to survive. Slowly, agonizingly, he reached into his belt and pressed the concealed antidote injector against his skin. The hiss of the injection was barely audible, but the relief was immediate. His vision cleared, his muscles loosened, and the sharpness of his mind returned. But the guards were almost on him. Shade dragged himself into the nearest alcove, his body still weak, but his instincts sharper than ever. He couldn't take them all down, not in his current state. He needed a new plan, something that would give him the advantage, something to turn the tide. As the guards swept through the corridor, their movements cautious but methodical, Shade's mind raced. The control systems were still down, the ship crippled by the virus he had uploaded. If he could get to one of the secondary systems, he might be able to trigger a secondary explosion, something to force the ship to retreat or, at the very least, to cover his escape. But he wasn't out of danger yet. The sound of the guards' voices filtered through the dim corridor. Spread out. He's weakened, but dangerous. Zarnak wants him alive. Good luck with that. Their voices were steady, disciplined. They were professionals, just like Shade. He had to move fast, before they closed in completely. Shade's hand hovered over his wrist device. He had one last trick up his sleeve. A short-range cloaking field that would render him invisible for a brief period. It wouldn't last long, but it would be enough to give him the element of surprise. He activated the device, and instantly, his form shimmered and vanished, blending seamlessly with the shadows. The guards entered the corridor, their weapons raised, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Shade watched from the darkness, waiting for his moment. One of the guards stepped closer, his weapon sweeping the alcove where Shade had just been lying. Too close. In a split second, Shade acted. He moved silently behind the guard, his blade flashing in the dim light. A quick, efficient strike to the base of the guard's neck, and the alien crumpled to the floor. Before the others could react, Shade slipped away, using the confusion to move further down the corridor. But his advantage wouldn't last. The cloak flickered, its power fading quickly. Shade gritted his teeth, pushing his weakened body harder. He needed to reach the secondary control room before the guards regrouped. His mind raced as he darted through the ship's narrow passageways, the walls closing in with every step. The ship's design was as unforgiving as its crew, cold, metallic, with sharp, angular architecture that made it difficult to find cover. Each turn felt like a gamble, each hallway a potential trap. He could still hear the guards behind him, their voices growing more frantic as they realized their target had slipped through their fingers once again. Just ahead, Shade spotted the entrance to the secondary control room. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached it, knowing that this was his last chance to turn the tables. The door was sealed, but Shade had anticipated this. With a few quick taps on his wrist device, he bypassed the lock, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the room was eerily quiet. Rows of consoles lined the walls, their displays flickering with alien script and tactical data. Shade moved quickly to the central control panel, his hands a blur as he began working through the ship's security protocols. The virus he had uploaded was still spreading through the system, but there was one final step he needed to complete: disabling the ship's reactor core. If he could do that, the flagship would be forced to retreat or risk catastrophic failure. It was a risky move, but Shade had no other choice. He couldn't leave the ship operational, not with Zarnak still in command. As he worked, Shade's thoughts drifted back to Earth. He thought of the Silent Order's teachings, the lessons that had shaped him into the weapon he had become. Stealth, precision, patience. The mission always came first, but there was something deeper at play now. This wasn't just about fulfilling orders or completing an objective. This was about survival, not just his own, but the survival of his entire world. The console beeped, snapping Shade out of his thoughts. He had bypassed the final security measure. All that remained was to initiate the overload sequence. But just as he reached for the final command, a voice cut through the silence. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Shade's blood ran cold. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto the figure standing in the doorway. Zarnak. The warlord's massive frame filled the entrance, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous mix of fury and amusement. "You've caused quite a mess, human," Zarnak growled, stepping into the room. "But it ends here." Shade's hand hovered over the console, his mind racing. If he initiated the overload now, he might be able to take the ship down, but Zarnak would kill him before he could escape. And without him, Earth would have no one left to warn them of the impending invasion. Zarnak smiled, as if reading Shade's thoughts. "You've done well to make it this far," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But you're out of time. Surrender now, and I might consider sparing you." Shade's mind whirled. His body was still weak, his options limited. But he had come too far to fail now. His eyes flicked to the console, then back to Zarnak. There was only one way out of this. With a sharp inhale, Shade reached for the console. Zarnak's eyes narrowed, and in an instant he lunged forward. But Shade wasn't aiming for the overload. Instead, he activated a different command, the ship's emergency containment protocol. The room's lights flickered as heavy blast doors slammed shut, sealing Zarnak and Shade inside the control room. The warlord's eyes widened in fury. "What have you done?" Shade's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was locked in here with Zarnak, no way out, no backup. Just him and the warlord. He had bought himself time. But now, the real battle was about to begin. Shade's heart raced, though his face remained impassive behind the dark fabric of his mask. The scent of burning metal lingered in the air, a remnant of the explosions he'd set just minutes ago to cripple the ship's systems. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he couldn't afford distraction. Not now. The final confrontation was near, and any lapse in focus could mean failure. He pressed his back against the cold metal of the bulkhead, listening as Zarnak's boots echoed ominously through the narrow corridor. The warlord's presence was more than physical, it was palpable, a force of raw power that filled the space. Shade's muscles tensed. This would be the last chance to stop him. Failure here wouldn't just mean death, it would mean the destruction of Earth. Everything rested on his ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and outfight Zarnak. "Come out, human!" Zarnak's voice rumbled down the hallway, carrying a cruel edge. "There's nowhere left to hide. Face me and accept your fate." Shade remained silent, measuring his options. The room ahead offered a critical advantage, the ship's auxiliary command center. If Shade could access it, he could reactivate the virus and shut down the few remaining systems still under Zarnak's control. But the warlord was too close, and Shade's body, still recovering from the neurotoxin, was too weak for direct confrontation. His eyes flicked to the small, rectangular device strapped to his wrist. The cloaking mechanism could buy him time, but not much. It was a risk, but it was the only move he had left. With a slow, deliberate motion, he activated the cloaking field. His form shimmered and vanished, blending seamlessly into the dim light of the corridor. The hum of the cloaking device was barely perceptible, but in the silence that followed Zarnak's taunt, every sound felt amplified. Shade moved quickly but carefully, his steps calculated and silent. He slipped past Zarnak, his eyes locking briefly onto the warlord's hulking figure. Zarnak stood with his arms crossed, his massive form cutting a menacing silhouette against the flickering lights. He wasn't just waiting, he was toying with Shade, confident in his own superiority. As Shade slid into the auxiliary command center, he exhaled slowly, allowing himself a moment to refocus. The room was a maze of consoles and dimly glowing monitors. Shade worked quickly, his fingers dancing across the alien technology with practiced precision. He had studied the ship's schematics for weeks, memorizing every detail. Now, that preparation paid off. The virus was still in place, but it had been blocked by Zarnak's emergency protocols. Shade bypassed the security measures one by one, each code he entered bringing him closer to total control of the ship. The tension in his chest eased slightly, just a little longer, and he would have the advantage. But the sudden shift in the air told him everything had changed. A deep, guttural growl echoed from the corridor behind him. Zarnak had moved. Shade's instincts flared to life, and he turned just in time to see the warlord's massive figure step into the room. The cloaking field had expired. He was exposed. "You can't hide forever, assassin," Zarnak said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've crushed better warriors than you. Your tricks won't save you." Shade's mind raced. He was out of time. The virus still needed a few more moments to complete its upload, and Zarnak wasn't the type to wait. The warlord's armor glinted menacingly, and in his hand he held a weapon Shade had never seen before, a massive, double-bladed axe that hummed with an eerie energy. One strike from that would be lethal. "You should have stayed hidden," Zarnak said, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Shade didn't respond. His mind was already calculating. Zarnak's size made him slow, but his brute strength was unmatched. Shade couldn't outmuscle him, but he could outthink him. The warlord lunged, swinging the axe with a terrifying speed that belied his size. Shade ducked just in time, the blade slicing through the console he'd been working on, sending sparks and debris flying across the room. He rolled to the side, keeping low, his body a blur of motion. Zarnak was relentless, his every step heavy and deliberate. Another swing, and this time Shade deflected the blow with a quick flick of his blade. But the force of the impact sent him skidding back, his arm vibrating from the sheer power behind the attack. He needed space. Shade backed toward the far wall, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. He glanced at the console, just a few more seconds. The virus was almost ready. But Zarnak wasn't going to give him those seconds. The warlord swung again, this time aiming for Shade's chest. Shade leaped into the air, twisting his body mid-flight to avoid the deadly arc of the blade. He landed behind Zarnak, his feet barely touching the ground before he launched himself forward, his own blade aiming for the warlord's exposed back. But Zarnak was faster than Shade anticipated. The warlord spun, catching Shade's blade with the haft of his axe. The clash of metal against metal rang out, filling the room with a deafening screech. Zarnak grinned, his teeth bared in a snarl of triumph. "You're finished," he growled. For a moment, it seemed true. Shade was pinned, his blade locked against Zarnak's, the warlord's immense strength bearing down on him. The weight was crushing, and Shade's arms trembled under the pressure. But then, a soft beep. Shade's eyes flicked toward the console. The virus had finished its upload. With a sudden surge of energy, Shade twisted his body, breaking free from the deadlock. He dove toward the console, slamming his hand down on the final command. Zarnak's roar of frustration echoed through the room as the lights flickered and then died. The ship's systems had gone offline, completely. Shade stood, breathing hard, his body tense as he watched Zarnak. The warlord's eyes glowed with fury. But there was something else there now, a flicker of doubt. "You think this changes anything?" Zarnak snarled, his voice filled with venom. "This ship may be disabled, but you're still trapped with me." Shade didn't reply. He knew the odds were still against him. But now, at least, he had leveled the playing field. Zarnak stepped forward, his axe raised. The next strike would be fatal. But Shade wasn't done yet. He reached into his belt, his fingers closing around the last explosive charge. He didn't have much time, but it would be enough. Zarnak lunged again, but this time Shade was ready. He sidestepped the blow, planting the explosive directly onto Zarnak's armor. The warlord's eyes widened in shock, but it was too late. Shade dove for cover just as the explosion rocked the room, the force of the blast sending debris flying in every direction. The walls shook, and for a moment, everything was chaos. When the dust settled, Shade rose slowly, his body aching, his vision blurred. But Zarnak was still standing. The warlord's armor was damaged, charred and cracked, but he was alive. Barely. Shade's heart sank. He had given everything he had, and yet Zarnak remained, a towering, unstoppable force. And now Shade was out of tricks. Zarnak took a step forward, blood dripping from his wounds, but his eyes still burning with determination. "You won't escape this time," Zarnak growled. Shade braced himself, knowing there was no turning back now. The final battle had begun.